Christ is in our midst. Oh, brothers and sisters, this is an easy story from the gospel, event in the gospel to preach about. Much easier than the Jesus going across the lake to the Gadarenes and going through all of that. That was the last time I preached. But this is very simple and very straightforward, isn't it? We all know the story. Jesus, as he's traveling afar off, there are a group of lepers. And they say afar off in the gospel simply because in those days, of course, lepers were untouchables. Leprosy was considered and is, in fact, contagious. And it was quite late in history that, in fact, I guess it was sulfa drugs in the 19th century, late 19th century, they were able to find a drug that would treat leprosy. Hence, these horrifying stories of people simply cut off. And you get the impression, especially that in the ancient world, if someone was afflicted by something like leprosy or some other disease or some kind of infirmity, physical infirmity, they were somehow forgotten by God or not beloved by God, or I'm not quite sure what it was. But one way or the other, the feeling of rejection, especially if you were afflicted with leprosy, was terrible. As you moved from one place to another, there was a bell normally that was associated to warn people of the coming of those who had leprosy, and a path was made for them to pass through, or they were supposed to, of course, walk around the village. So that's why you see this. You see these two words, from afar off, from afar off. But they cry out to Jesus, don't they? Just like the blind men, they cry out to Jesus. And why? Because this is their chance, so to speak. They've suffered terribly, and they see in their midst the possibility of healing, the possibility of some relief from this terrible fate that they've suffered. And so people always tell loudmouths to be quiet, blind men were told to be quiet, you're bothering the master, just leave him alone. But Jesus always said, let them come to me. In this case, Jesus, as they approach him, says to them, what I want you to do is go and this is interesting too. He says, go and show yourselves to the priests. And there were 10 of them. And so they began to do as he told them to do. Now, I guess that was in effect, if you read in the book, I think it's in the book of Leviticus, but there was sort of a procedure. If you felt as though you were no longer leprous, you could go to the high priest or one of the priests, and they would somehow certify the fact that you were free from the disease. So that's what Jesus tells them to do. Go show yourselves. Go show yourselves to the priest. And so as they're going, and this is interesting, the healing doesn't happen right away. But it says as they were on their way, they began to be healed. And can you imagine that sort of scene, so to speak, as they're moving along on this journey, visibly, literally, their leprosy begins to clear up. And it's a remarkable, it's a lot more like life really is, isn't it? We have these moments of inspiration and touching by God, which really wake us up and give us a remarkable kind of insight into who we are as human beings. And those kinds of insights will sustain us in many ways for the rest of our lives. We'll remember those things right away. But at the same time, after that, there's the work to be done. And most of the real conversion happens in this kind of movement. I think of St. Paul. Yes, he had his experience on the road to Damascus, but we hear much more about St. Paul. He goes to Damascus. He hides in the city. They lower him down in a basket. And then it takes years before he actually joins the apostles and begins to preach the gospel. It says he went off through Arabia, whatever that means. But then he was back in Tarshish, his hometown. But it took a good while before there was enough trust in the Christian community of him, because after all, he murdered, more or less. He murdered St. Stephen, didn't he? He set up the situations for him to be stoned. So this kind of on the way reminds me a little bit of that. Think of Mary in Egypt in the desert. It took decades. It took decades for her to somehow recover from her former life and to present herself worthy of receiving the Holy Eucharist, which was brought to her by the monk, that discovers her in the desert many decades later. But she talks about her struggles in the desert and how she had to struggle against all the memories and all the difficulties that she had passed through. Ultimately, all of these people finally placed themselves in the hands of God. And that's what these lepers do too. All the other alternatives are over with. No one will treat them. There's no cure, so to speak, of the physicians. So the only healing alternative for them ultimately is what? It is Jesus Christ. And so as they are, as it says before, as they are on their way, they begin to notice that they're healed. And can you imagine, the suffering begins to fall away from their bodies. And they look at themselves, and they are, in fact, pure, free, healed from this disease. Now, what's interesting is, and it says here, that most of them continue along their way, maybe to show themselves to the priest or not, I don't know. Most of them continue along their way, but one turns back and calls out Jesus and thanks him, in effect, expresses gratitude, as it says, gives glory to God, and falls down at the face of Jesus, or at the feet of Jesus. He falls, and it's interesting because Jesus looks at him and he says, weren't there 10? Weren't there 10? And only this, and by the way, he says, and only this foreigner, he was a Samaritan, okay, only this foreigner comes back and gives thanks. Only this foreigner. It would kind of, I suppose, be, well, I won't give lots of suggestions. But only this foreigner, only this Samaritan, another person rejected, comes back and gives thanks. And then Jesus says to him, go ahead, go forward, in life. Your faith has made you well. Your faith, your trust, and also your gratitude. Because part of faith, brothers and sisters, is in fact, isn't it? It's this practice, this living practice of gratitude. If we miss out on it, we miss out on giving thanks to God for everything, for our trials and for our joys, for our struggles and for our, so to speak, blessings. And and so this is, as Father Tom once said, Father Tom and I do this to each other back and forth all the time. You've got to have, Father Tom, you've got to have an attitude of gratitude. That's an old. But one way or the other, this is so much part of the Christian life. I want to tell you a story about gratitude. I don't know if I've told you this before. I can't remember any longer. I used to be able to kind of remember if I told you something that I told you a month ago, but now I can't remember. So just nod and smile. That's very nice, Father. Yes, yes. And then if you want to tell me something later, you can just tell me privately. But when I was, I had a lot of cousins in Utah growing up there, in a Mormon kind of world, Not being Mormon, but being around them. My mother never had me baptized. But amongst these cousins, and they were all wonderful people, some of them have passed on, but I guess I probably, from this one parent, my grandparents, there must be well over 100, 125 people, at this point, at this stage of the game. But anyway, within this group of cousins they had, there was one who was especially, and is still living, especially, I would say, gifted with a kind of compassion and understanding and spirituality. He took his religion seriously and all of that, always has. and the genuine article, you know. But even at the age of, you know, I think we were 10 or 11, 12 when this all happened. Even at that time, it was really always a joy to be around him. But he was just, you know, but he was a humble kid too. Anyway, to make a short story long, we were fishing a river in the nearby canyon in Payson Canyon, okay? Which, by the way, believe it or not, the town of Payson, which is this small little, it's not little any longer, but when I grew up, now has an Orthodox church in it. It just blew me away when I found out about this. Father Justin, who was in Salt Lake, built a missionary sort of campus from Salt Lake Parish, and now they have a church, a beautiful church in Payson, Utah. It just amazes me. But to get back to our story, there we were fishing in Payson Canyon, and I'm throwing out my line and everything, and I lose the hook on a rock or something. And so I go to get another hook in my pocket, and guess what? I left my hooks, I don't know, a quarter of a mile down when we were sitting, a quarter of a mile up the creek, up the river. And I said, oh, doggone it. And he said, what's wrong? And I said, oh, I left my hooks back at the rock there. And he said, well, I'll go get them. I said, no, it's all right. No, I'll go get them for you. I'll go get them. And so he went and got them. In about, 20 minutes, he came back. It was, it's a bit of a slog to get those hooks. And he came back, and he handed them to me, and I took them and put them in my pocket and threaded the thing. And in a very humble but direct way, he said, you're welcome. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. But it was too late. It's kind of like sometimes when your wife says, too late. Too late. You can't. It doesn't make it late. I'm sorry for doing that. Too late. It doesn't happen very often. But maybe it does. But the main thing was that I felt at that moment a real devastation inwardly because of who this kid was. This cousin of mine was. He was a believer. He was kind. He was good. He had faith in God. I don't know how to put it. All of those things came together and still do in this man. And I felt terrible that I hadn't expressed gratitude. I hadn't expressed gratitude to him. And to this day, I'm preaching to you about it. To this day, I'm preaching to you about it. So it was a good lesson. It was a good lesson in just remembering the importance of gratitude. Now, what should we be gracious about? It makes sense, I would say, brothers and sisters, at the end of each day, to just sit down in your prayers for just a moment and review the day, identifying what you're thankful for, all the little things that happened, the help that was offered, the possibilities that were fulfilled, the good things that were allowed to occur. You name it. And you'll see, of course, that we're being watched over all the time. We're not somehow out there alone, but we get the impression because we're isolated we isolated our minds. But in fact, we're taken care of constantly by God and His angels, our guardian angel, through our friends, through providential encounters and events. If there's one thing I would say, especially as the Nativity Feast approaches, brothers and sisters, one of the things I've learned to be particularly thankful for and have gratitude for is how the life of the church, how the church itself moves us through time. You know what I'm saying? We don't wander around on this planet not knowing where we are, do we? We don't. We know where we are in the life of the church. Where do we live? Well, right now, of course, we're celebrating the Divine Liturgy together. We're going to receive the body and blood of Christ, for that Eucharistic gathering, which remembers Christ and gives thanks to Him. And when we are called upon to offer Him, to remember, what is our greatest remembrance? What do we remember more than anything else? We remember the sacrifice that Christ made upon the cross and His coming resurrection. That's what we're most thankful for as Orthodox Christians, I would say. But if you look at the life of the church and how that message gets carried through our feasts, you know, through all the things that we do, through our relationships with one another, you know, through our relationships with one another. All of this is part of the way the church moves us, gives us a life through time. The time that we live on this earth is, it may be short, it may be long, but one way or the other, it's a tremendous blessing. We live from Eucharist to Eucharist, from Lord's Day to Lord's Day, from feast to feast, from Pascha to Pascha, right? From the first coming of the Lord to the second coming of the Lord. We live, that's our place in history, that's our place in time. And so I give thanks for that, you know. We should have great gratitude in our hearts that the Lord has seen fit to allow us to participate in something like this. Does that make sense? Okay, I think I've worn you out though. So listen, brothers and sisters, show gratitude. Remember to do it. It's so easy to forget, but boy, it covers a multitude of sins, I think, because we suddenly, you know, it wakes us up and reminds us that we're in fact being cared for, that we are being cared for. Okay? Christ is in our midst. Yes.